founders, held in celebration of this 50th year of the Sleep Research Society. I'm Sonyan Kohli-Israel, Professor of Psychiatry at the University of California, San Diego, and Chair of the Sleep Research Society Presidential Task Force on this 50th year of the SRS. In this series of conversations, we will learn from the men and women who both founded and sustained the field of sleep over the last 50 years. Our hope is that you, our viewers, those of you who have been in the field for a long time and those of you new to the field, will understand where we came from and understand our history, because it is only by knowing our past that we know how to go forward into the future.
My name is Tom Roth. I'm the director of the Sleep Center at Henry Ford Hospital in Detroit, Michigan. And I'm going to be interviewing Dr. William Dement, who has many appointments, but I guess the head of the Sleep Center at Stanford University for the vast majority of his career. So I'm going to take you back early into your career, and I've heard you on many occasions, talk about the fact that Dr. Kleitman was probably the most influential person in terms of getting you interested in the whole field of sleep. So, what was your first? When did you first meet Dr. Kleitman, and what was your first interaction with him like?
Well, I like to say I heard his lecture, and we were medical students were being encouraged to hook up with people to do research, and there was biochemistry and kind of fashionable things, but as I had heard him lecture, and I really liked the notion of sleep and consciousness and so on. So I went kind of an old building. Anyway, went to his office and knocked on the door with a tiny bit of trepidation. And the door, my memory is the door opened about 6 inches. Yes, and I said, I'm interested in doing research with you. He said, have you read my book? I said, well, no. He said, well, read it, and then if you want to, come back, something like that. It was fairly brusque, but I read his book, and I guess the thing that drew me into sleep research, even though a lot of the work was surveys and that sort of thing, some might call purely physiological. The book was so well written. I mean, that I could actually read it was kind of a miracle, and I think that a lot of that was it was very well written, very well documented, very well organized, etc. And I would say that personified him.
But so this wasn't a man who sort of was charismatic, right? I mean,
no,
sort of slammed it
no,
over.
He was not charismatic in the usual sense.
So what was in the air? I mean, I sort of go back to that medical school at that point in time, and it was, yourself, who obviously had a, tremendous impact on the field, but also in the medical school at that time, Elliot Weitzman, Dr. Bob Moore.
Yeah.
Did you three interact while you were medical students together?
Sure. Well, I mean, we talked, but we didn't. They weren't very interested in what I was doing. Mm-hmm. As the whole dream story and rapid eye movement story began to emerge, they did get sort of interested. That they were doing some research. I don't exactly remember, and we would certainly talk. But by the time the rapid eye movement relationship to dreaming and other aspects of what went on in the body during REM sleep was really starting to be a story, we graduated. And I decided, this is why my relatives were not that happy, I decided to stay with Kleitman and get a postdoctoral fellowship and not go on and do an internship, because I was right in the midst of all of this work. And because the lab was small, and essentially one person could sleep at a time, it took a long time to gather data. And then he went on sabbatical, I remember. So I put a cot in his office. There was kind of a chemistry lab, and then there was another room, which I guess was a chemistry lab also, because it had a hood. And there was his office. I could put a cot in his office. I could run 2 subjects at a time. It was incredible. But but the grass machine had only 4 channels, so you could only devote two channels per person. And I sort of got by really looking for eye movements primarily, and then sampling the EEG and that sort of thing. But it was hard. And then if I fell asleep, which happened frequently, this is when a mess could occur, as everyone who's done this well knows. The paper would go all over the place, and the pens and the ink and so on. And it was a constant battle to keep things clean enough that I didn't get kicked out. So.
Well, we take it back to Chicago. You know, when I was in high school, there was a disc jockey called Jolly West.
Yes.
Jolly West stayed up for 10 days and 10 nights in the middle of Times Square. He was the top 40 disc jockey. I used to listen to him every night out of class. Now, one of the apocryphal stories, and this was an NIH-funded study by Dr. Charlie West. And one of the apocryphal stories I heard, and I just want to know if this is true or not, you drove down from Chicago with a polygraph, and you sort of read that his vigil was going to be over, and requested to report his recovery sleep.
That was Randy Gardner.
I know I requested to recover his, I think so.
Yeah.
The question is, was I already in New York?
Oh, you were in New York already, okay.
I'm not sure now. Right now, as I'm trying to remember this, but it was right around that period. And I did go to, he was in a hotel, the Astor Hotel. I mean, he was set up in real luxury. Jolly West was an operator. And part of the perks were steak dinners and stuff like that. And the only thing was that I think it's safe to say this now, that the disc jockey was getting a huge amounts of Ritalin. And he did have kind of a psychotic episode, but, you know, he had enough Ritalin to account for it, probably. And then, but he had a huge long REM period when he went to sleep, and that, I would say that reinforced my idea that if he hadn't had that, he might really have stayed insane, and then started me again on a long period of time.
Let me follow up with that. I mean, that's sort of an interesting thing, you know. So, you know, there's your very, very classic paper on REM deprivation, you know, and you know, in science, and you know, the bizarre behavior associated with it, you know, and pretty, you know, 20, 30 years later, I submitted a research to my IRB, and I want to do REM deprivation. And I said, "What are you, crazy? You can't do REM deprivation. If you REM deprive people, they go crazy." And the IRB said no. And I said, "What do you mean they go crazy?" Well, Dement showed that. And and you believe that. So my question is, when you did the first REM deprivation study, was that with a little bit of trepidation? I mean, you know, you believe that people, when they get REM deprived, they're going to become psychotic.
I don't know. I don't think I had trepidation at all in the early days. I don't know. There weren't very many regulations. People didn't say no very often. Yeah, no, I don't think I. You know, the thought, what will I do if they become psychotic?
Right.
I wanted them to become psychotic. That's not good. But I will say that part of that, I had worked as a medical student at a place called Manteno State Hospital before Thorazine. And there were at least 5,000 chronic and acute schizophrenics that I mingled with. So that if I ever had any fear of people with insanity, I certainly lost it during that time.
So your move was then to Stanford University, being recruited by David Hamburg. What was Dr. Hamburg? I mean, Dr. Hamburg's made a tremendous number of contributions. What was his big impact on you in terms of your sleep career?
Well, he was very supportive, number one, and very encouraging, but his major thing was I could do whatever I wanted. I couldn't think of ever being said, well, maybe you shouldn't do that, or just always go ahead and do it. But the point also was that was a time when you could sneeze and get a grant. I mean, and I think the cost of living was very low also. I remember my first postdoctoral fellowship was $3,000 for a whole year. Think about it. And we actually lived on that. So
Living on that, did you ever have this fantasy that at some point somebody's going to say, well, you've been playing at this thing for like 10 years, but you were trained as a doctor, it's time to go grow up?
yes, I did have that. I had that fantasy fairly often. And I really, we still have this, in my opinion, this great loose end about sleep deprivation. I think Al Rechtschaffen's work is extremely important, but it hasn't really been replicated. And in terms of those kinds of concerns, I would say narcolepsy saved my life in the sense that I realized there are these people who need help. And Al Rechtschaffen and I had found, our first paper was 9 subjects. And amazingly, when I got really interested in that, in the entire 10 million plus population of New York City, I couldn't find any more. And so I sort of gave up on that. But when I got to Stanford, I can't remember, somewhere along the line, I think it was in New York, I realized that during REM periods, they were paralyzed. And although we saw muscle tone go down in cats and other animals and chin electrodes, whatever, it wasn't clear how paralyzed, at least in my mind, how paralyzed people really were during REM sleep. And then when I saw narcoleptics have cataplectic attacks, and then actually saw sleep onset REM periods, I mean, it was like, I like to think it didn't take more than 10 minutes to kind of put it all together. And then the issues out at Stanford was to find more narcoleptic patients. And here again, I struck out on everything in terms of the hospital, the clinic, the records. You could burrow through records back then. And at some point, a light bulb went off. Why don't you put an advertisement in the newspaper? I mean, it's like I never thought of that. And it was just a little want ad describing attacks of paralysis when you laugh or get angry and having trouble staying awake. And I got maybe 100 letters and began studying these individuals. And I had at least 50 narcoleptics right off the bat. And then I realized there had to be more. And my story is then we said, let's have a narcolepsy clinic, and we'll actually treat patients, and we give them Ritalin and whatever they need. And it was enormously successful, except that they couldn't pay their bills, and it went bankrupt very quickly. But I had all this patient population that I could study, and so we did more studies on narcolepsy and more studies on narcolepsy, and got more and more interested in the paralysis, and realizing more and more that it was also present in REM sleep. And then I began to think, gosh, it'd be great if you could have an animal model. Alan Hobson was working on cholinergic stimulation of the brainstem. I'm thinking maybe that could be an animal model. And somewhere along the line, I was sent a little film clip from a veterinarian of a dog. We took movies. Christian Gilmano was with me by that time. We took movies of cataplectic attacks, and it's really pretty dramatic. A person would be standing perfectly normal and be completely paralyzed. I can't say how many times people say you faked that. But anyway, I would show that film everywhere I went, and finally someone said, I have a movie of a dog that sort of does that. And it was actually a movie from somebody at UC Davis, whose name I've forgotten, But the dog came up to his dish of food and then just collapsed. And I started going, that's it. And so I'd show now the movie of, Chris John would remember the name of this guy. There was this one narcoleptic that was always available to film. And I showed his film clip, plus the dog, everywhere I went. And in Boston, in 1973, there must have been a sleep meeting in Boston at that time. There was something, but I showed the movie.
Cape Cod.
Cape Cod. Yeah. Anyway, someone said, well, I know a neurologist in Saskatoon who has he's described a dog that does this. And I got in touch with the owners of the dog, and I said, if you send the dog to Stanford, we'll study the dog, it won't hurt him. It was a her. And they said, sure, you can have the dog. And it was right at that time that Richard Nixon, he was president, and I'm quite sure what he did is he could no longer because I'm hoping you're but the story is that I wanted them to ship the dog to me, and the airline then was Western Airlines between Saskatoon and San Francisco, and I called the airlines, and I told the story several times, but somebody, and I assume it was a senior vice president, said, we don't ship sick dogs on airplanes. Our airplanes don't carry sick dogs. And I tried to explain the dog wasn't really sick, it just had a neurological problem. No sick dogs on airplanes, no sick. And I said, well, I'll drive up to Saskatoon. Well, then I couldn't get gas. And at some point, again, the light bulb went off, call your congressman. I've never called my congressman in my life. I never even thought of it. I don't know. His name was Pete McCluskey, by the way, and he ran against Lyndon Johnson. And I actually met him less than 3 months ago again. Anyway, I called his office, and I talked to whoever was the chief there, and explained my problem. And he said, oh, we'll certainly try to help you. And I like to say 20 minutes later my phone rang, and it was the president of Western Airlines, and said, whatever you want, we're ready to do it. And they shipped the dog down to Stanford, and we named her Monique, and she was an absolutely classic dog with narcolepsy, and did everything. And then the issue was, if there's one dog, there must be more. And I've kind of forgotten this, but I then embarked on a kind of like national campaign to find more dogs and contact veterinarians. I think Mary Korsgaard was with me by this time. Yes, she had to be, but Mary Korsgaard can tell her own story. But we found more dogs, and then other people, we began to inbreed them. And finally, with Doberman Pinschers, I think there was initially a litter that didn't survive, but finally there was a litter of 7 puppies. And my memory is that on one day, they all collapsed when someone was playing with them. And the whole group had a classic cataplectic attacks. And we were on our way. And I maintained my points up there are that I maintained that colony 30 years ago. Well, anyway, until Emmanuel Mignot finally discovered the abnormality. But it was really, people would criticize, you mean you're going to spend $40,000 a year just to feed dogs? When's ever going to get, you're doing dog research, why aren't you doing more in human beings, and blah, 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 blah. And I had to I guess it's almost like a religious faith that by God, as science caught up, you know, there'd be something there. There had to be something there, obviously.
In terms of maintaining those, one of my very fond memories was Elliot Weitzman and a couple of us, we did a site visit for your narcolepsy.
Oh, yes, and I remember that vividly.
It was amazing. And your dean, who was trying to be very supportive,
Yeah.
said, this research is so important. I don't really care whether you fund this or not. Stanford will fund it. And I remember you just turned green, you know. But anyway.
Oh, and you had, we won't go into it, but you had been on another site.
Yes, we did. It was the great days of the National Institute. This was actually one of my great memories, you know, it's about a year, but, you know, we were actually a traveling site visit. People don't even know what site visits are, but in those days people had site visits. We went to different locations to site visit people. But let's get back to your history. One of the things you mentioned is Congressman McCloskey. So I want to turn to another chapter in your incredible career, and that is a whole area of advocacy, which is, you know, not a trivial part of your life, a very major part of your life. And while, you know, everybody who's attending, these 6,000 people are here, know about the National Center of Sleep Disorders Research, you had a lot of false thoughts before that. Tell us a little bit about, you know, one of the things that I remember very distinctly is Project Sleep. You know, tell us about that initiative.
Well, Project Sleep was the first NIH initiative, and it was now I hope I'm remembering this right. There were about 20 of us, or 10. We were maybe going to write a book, and it just, I don't think it was well funded, or for some reason it didn't quite work. But that helped a lot in getting acquainted with going to Washington and talking to people at NIH. And I used to actually, I'm not quite sure I'm supposed to carry this on, but Mary Karska and I had worked over the holidays, I think, and I decided, and we were late, so I decided to fly the grant to Washington, D.C., which I did. And I went to wherever there was an address where you delivered grants. And I had this vivid memory, which is very humbling, I must say, at the same time. The guy took my grant, this grant we'd written, which is, I don't know, you used to be able to write grants as big as you wanted to. And he took it and he just threw it on a pile. And I just could hardly believe my eyes. Wait a minute, that must be the pile of discarded grants. I said, no, those are all new grants. And, oh, God, it must have been several hundred at least. But I was very concerned that the National Institutes of Health began to decrease their funding of sleep research. And I think a lot of other things were coming to the fore, molecular biology, et cetera, and sleep didn't have a lot of that. And I thought, well, there's really got to be more advocacy, and there got to be more people that know about sleep. And I think the way I gave a talk in Portland, Oregon, and met someone, and that someone was a very close friend of the chief of staff of a very influential senator. And really that was the whole thing. And this very influential senator actually came to a meeting, or rather he invited me to his office in Washington. I got to know his staff very well. His name is Mark Hatfield. He is now retired and lives in, I think, Palm Springs. And then he set up a meeting of the Appropriations Committee of the Congress in Portland, and you may have been there. So I invited a number of sleep researchers to testify, but it was really his show, and he was doing it simply so he could go back to Washington and introduce legislation to create a National Center on Sleep Disorders Research. The actual hearing, it was actually a hearing of the Appropriations Committee of the Congress of the United States, and there's literally just one senator and his staff, and it took place in Portland, Oregon, and I feel like the election was the next day, but that had nothing much to do with it. But he said, he announced that the first thing he was going to do when he got back to Washington, the next congressional season started. Now that would have been then January. I want to say 80. I don't know, something about it. But anyway, he did introduce that legislation. Then we had to go around to various congressional offices and get people to sign. We needed 4 signatures, and we got the senator in New Mexico. His name is Bingaman, Mark Hatfield, of course, and the senator from Rhode Island. And I'm blocking on his name right now, but a constituent from Rhode Island was with me, and one other senator whose name I can't remember. Anyway, that enabled them to pass it. I actually have a film. It might have been Kennedy, but I have a film clip of Kennedy introducing the legislation to the entire Senate, and he actually screwed up the wording. But anyway, it was passed, and it didn't. It sort of came at the same time as the budget crisis for the entire country, so it was never funded in the way that I had hoped. Then there was a period of time when the question was, all right, the Congress isn't going to appropriate millions of dollars to fund this center. If it goes into somewhere, and at that time we finally had, our group had a Washington representative whose name was Mr. Dale Dirks, or his father, Harley Dirks, actually. But we went around to the various institute directors saying, we've got this National Center on Sleep Disorders Research, can we put it in your institute? And now as I'm remembering it, the budget had not yet been established. I, in fact, have a file that I look at now. I don't know why I look at it with bitterness or satisfaction or what, but it says, if we receive $50 million, we will do this. If we receive $40 million, we will do this. 10 million, we will do this. You know, I couldn't conceive that it would be less than 5 million. And but it turned out that it was left up to the institute, and the only institute director who was really welcoming was Dr. Claude L'Enfant, who was the director of the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute. And he accepted it. It was established in his institute. I as a center within an institute, but it never had its own budget. I don't think that's still something to be remedied, and something for the sleep societies to advocate. But it nonetheless had an identity, and we had literally created a new agency.
So from this journey of Chicago in 1961 to, where are we? San Antonio, Texas in 2010. I mean, you started out with a vision of trying to figure out mental illness. I mean, I think that was a big portion was schizophrenia. And then and you wound up starting a field. Well, was that a progressive change? When did your vision change? When did you know that this was going to happen?
No, there's
when did you know that 6,000 people are going to come
I can't quite remember the year, but I know that President Nixon froze grant funds. And with the dogs I had and other projects going on, I was spending maybe $20,000 a month. It was a lot of, whatever amount it was, it bothered everybody. And as everything was in deficit because there was no money. And I don't know what I was up to, but I know the dean of the medical school was getting uncomfortable, and I didn't want to give up any of my dogs. And so I just said, we got to have another source of funds. And I wasn't much of a fundraiser going out to Carnegie or the Rockefellers or whatever. I said, we could start a clinic. And we knew there were a lot of people who complained of insomnia and so on. And we could start a clinic and have our own money. So in the summer of 1970, with a colleague, Dr. Vincent Zarconi, And I really like to say, if Vince had not been there, I don't think I would have had the courage to do it absolutely all by myself. But he was a boarded psychiatrist, and I expected we'd get some crazy people, and that would be great. So he and I opened the Stanford University Sleep Disorders Clinic, which is, as far as I know, the world's first. And the one little sideline of that is we held a press conference, and one reporter came, and I'm trying to explain to him how it's really important to have a sleep clinic, and there are all these people who complain, and da-da-da-da-da-da-da. He's taking notes. And then at the end of the interview, he said, Dr. Dement, how do you feel about co-sleeping? And I said, is this off the record? He said, oh yeah, off the record. I said, well, I think it's okay for kids to sleep with their parents. Well, a lot of reasons. I mean, I embarked on a dissertation on co-sleeping, and several, I don't know how long an interval was in between getting a phone call at 4 o'clock in the morning. This is ABC. Are you the Stanford professor that recommends communal sleeping? And somehow or other, this story had mushroomed, and he had actually written about how I felt people could co-sleep, or I think I had some comment about, look, if you think that your children are going to be upset by sex, you do it on the kitchen table. I mean, I thought, now, it was off the record, man. So if you ever hear that phrase, oh, sure, it's off the record, ignore it completely. That's my advice. But at any rate, our clinic did get open. Christian Gilmano was a true pioneer in this field, especially in the field of sleep disorders, had come to Stanford on some weird fellowship in 1970, and I'm not going to say the name of the guy he had to work for, but they couldn't get along at all, and that was perfectly not Christian's fault whatsoever. And a man named Steve Hendrickson, who's one of the pioneers, was working with me then, and I don't know how they got to know each other, but he said, well, we could use you over here in the animal lab. So Dr. Christian Gilmano worked about 6 months in our very primitive animal lab, and then he went back to France. And our clinic, then we were starting to think we needed a neurologist. Dr. Christian Gilmano was a neurologist. And Vince Sarconi, he said, Bill, there's just the person. Christian Gilmano, he's a neurologist. He needs a job. Let's see if we can get him back. So that was in the meeting in Bruges, Belgium. Christian Gilmano was there, and we said, you want to come to Stanford and, be associate director of the clinic, assistant director, whatever? Yeah. And he arrived in January of 1972. And at that time, we were seeing maybe 10 patients a week. I don't remember. Boy, did we have a struggle to get going. But he knew about the sleep apnea work that had been done in Europe. Lou Geraci had done something, and some small group in France. And I had just written a huge program project for NIH on narcolepsy. And so he wanted to add a lot of material on sleep apnea, and I said, no way. I like to say we probably came to blows over that. I'm sure we really didn't, but he finally had his way, and we included some stuff on the sleep apnea, and then, but at that point in time, for narcolepsy or sleepy people, we were sort of the only game in town. I'm pretty sure until Elliot Weitzman came to Stanford on a sabbatical in 1974-75 and went back to Montefiore Hospital and started the second sleep clinic in the world, we were the only game in town. So everybody who was sleepy, if they heard anything about us, came to Stanford. And began to realize most of these people didn't have narcolepsy. They had something else. And that something else was sleep apnea. And I think in the early days of the clinic, it was like 80 to 90% obstructive sleep apnea. You know, it really got going. And one of the biggest regrets in my life is that the first treatment we could offer was chronic tracheostomy. And a lot of patients refused that. You know, that was a pretty horrifying kind of thing. And we weren't able to really closely follow those patients. You know, we had severely ill patients that we didn't do anything for them. We weren't, I would say we weren't acutely aware that obstructive sleep apnea could be causal to cardiovascular problems, but a lot of them had cardiovascular problems. But we just didn't follow them closely. And I say 10 years later, when I made the effort, I couldn't locate any of them. I like to say they all died, but I don't really know that. But sleep apnea then became the breadwinner for the clinic, and it became obvious that this was a very prevalent problem. And you know, at that point, one thing led to another, I would say, and other people got interested. Elliot got interested, John Kershan in Houston got interested, you guys, and Milt Kramer and others got interested in Cincinnati, et cetera, et cetera.
Let me ask you one last question, because you're the only person we can ask this question to. So if we sort of look at your career, you know, I don't think anybody else can be asked this question. If you look at your career, you spend a significant amount of time as a basic scientist, working PCPA, REM deprivation, genetic basis of narcolepsy. You're an amazing clinical researcher, you know, from early studies in human REM deprivation to recent studies like Apple's looking at the clinical consequences of sleep apnea. So that's a second career, more than enough career for most people. You had a third career, which was education. One of the things that always stunned me until I died is that you had 1 year, produced 3 PhDs named Mary Kursgard, you know, Chuck Seisler, and Lloyd Glenn, which is just an amazing. And then you had a fourth career called, you know, advocacy, government advocacy. So you sort of encumbered 4 careers, which is a pretty amazing thing. Which of those, in reflecting back, was the most rewarding for you?
No, I think it was clinical. I mean, seeing clinics, you know, open up all over the country, realizing there was an incredible need for this. You know, and people would honest to God say, do you think it's all these sleep clinics that are creating the, you know, that, no, my God. It boggles my mind to think how many people died prematurely before we knew anything about obstructive sleep apnea, for example, or falling asleep at the wheel, or, you know, you can just go on and on and on. That is, I would say, you know, and intellectually, I certainly, no question, that's the most rewarding thing. I'm very pleased at my age to kind of semi-discovered something new and interesting, which is that people who lower their sleep deprivation kind of accumulates, and there's kind of people who think they have a personal best do better if they get rid of their sleep debt. And so nobody should tell anybody this yet until Stanford wins lots of championships.
Anyway, on behalf of myself, we gave a career to, on behalf of 6,000 or 10,000 sleep researchers around the universe and hundreds of millions of patients, thank you very much, Dr. Dement, for an amazing career.
You're very